The same craft that could lift a king onto the throne in early Ireland was the craft that could end his kingship. The poets, the filí, held both directions of that power. They could compose praise that raised a person's standing, and they could compose satire that raised actual blisters on a king's face. Once these blisters showed up, the king was deemed no longer fit to rule in a public shame. So I'm Laura O'Brien, and this is episode 2 of the cursing series at the Irish Pagan School. If you missed episode 1, the foundation that we laid was the simple historical fact that in Ireland, the same practitioner who could heal could curse. And we're carrying that thesis through every episode in this series. So today we're looking at the filí, the trained professional poets of early Ireland, and these were the descendants of the druids. And we're going to look at how their craft sat at the centre of one of the most precise and legally regulated forms of cursing the Irish tradition ever produced. So let's begin with the filí themselves and the status that they held, just so you have the context. So the filí, or singular fila, were the trained professional poets of early Ireland. And they held this status that no one else in their society shared. The training was really long, like years and years of memorization, composition, history, genealogy, the legal traditions from the Brehon law system, and the meters of formal poetry. So by the time a poet reached the highest grade, they were carrying an enormous body of cultural knowledge in their heads, and they were paid accordingly. So the filí were considered the noble descendants of the druids, which were an older priestly class of Ireland from before Christianity arrived. And when the druids as a formal class or hierarchy within the society declined, much of their authority, their learning, their social position, their skills, all of those passed on to the filí. They were members of the aisnés, the people of skill, and they held nemed status, which was the legal category for the sacred, which they shared with kings and clerics, priests. So the highest grade of poet was the Ollamh, and the Ollamh held an honour price equal to the king of a Tuath, a local kingdom, and that's the technical legal measure. So everyone in early Irish society had an honour price, which was the legal value placed on their standing within the society. And the Ollamh's price was set at the same level as the king or queen that they served. So the filí also held a privilege almost no one else enjoyed, which was free movement across the various Tuath of Ireland. They could show up anywhere at any time. For anyone else moving outside their own Tuath, they would lose their honour price. Once you leave your Tuath, you leave your standing and your status. But the filí kept theirs everywhere because their work required them to travel, and the law system made room for that. So that status is the foundation for everything else I want to tell you in this episode. The power to compose praise and the power to compose satire was concentrated in this trained class, and the legal system treated their words with the same seriousness as it treated any other formal act of speech or the words of any king. So how did satire actually work? Well, the technical word for satire in early Irish was aircetal, and it wasn't a casual term for being rude about someone. It was a regulated, named form of legal speech with rules, conventions, and consequences. So the Old Irish scholarship records a treatise from the Book of Ballymote called Sis Lir Fola Ara, which translates as, how many types of satire are there? And the answer that the treatise gives is 3. there are 3 types of satire. So the first is named as aisnés, a declaration in reproach. The form that satire takes when it's narrated openly without rhyme. It's like a public verbal complaint with the target named and the wrong stated. The second form is all, the insult, often a sticking nickname that follows the target for the rest of their life. This is the curse of being named as something ridiculous or humbling. So the example in the manuscripts is a church given the name of the Church of Wretched Repast, after it offered a stingy meal to visiting clergy, and the nickname clung to it forever. Now you'll notice I said visiting clergy, not visiting filí, which means that the clergy, priests, bishops, the monks, they had the power of satire as well. Remember, they were in the same class as the filí and the king. So the third form is aircetal, the incantation of satire, the most formal poetic form. And this is the one with 10 named subdivisions. Excuse me, I'm recovering my chest infection here, so my throat is a little bit scratchy. I do apologize. It's also why this video is a little bit later in the series than I was expecting. Anyway, 10 named subdivisions. And the most powerful of these subdivisions is the glám, dícend, which the academic literature treats as a satire severe enough to kill. There are saga examples of a satirized man dying of shame on the spot after the glám dícend was performed against him. And interestingly, in a kind of a cross-cultural comparison, you probably know, most people know of the idea of voodoo dolls, which are obviously not from Irish culture. The glám dícend may have been performed with a little clay doll and blackthorn thorns being put into the clay. So, interesting aside. Now, alongside these 3 forms of satire, the law tracts also name several kinds of low-status satirists outside the trained class of filí. The glossary called Sanas Cormaic names them as concha, the rindala, and the dúil. So all were treated with low legal status, and the concha in particular is like etymologized in the later glossaries as being like a dog snarling. So these were the very base forms of satire. And then the female satirists were a whole category of their own. The Brehon case from the Ulster Cycle tale, Longus mac Nushlan, really shows it clearly. So Brehon was a ban concha, a woman satirist of low social birth. Now, ban concha is also a name, just as an aside, that is given to the goddess Morrigan in a tale called Tón Orgavna. Just again, another interesting aside. So this woman satirist, Brehon, was of low social birth, and yet the law said that no one could keep her out of a house because the risk of refusing her was too high. The compiler of this tale, Longus mac Nushlan, put it directly, and I quote, "No person ever was allowed into that court except her foster father and her foster mother and Brehon, for the last mentioned one couldn't be prevented, for she was a satirist." Now, while we're on this layer of tradition, before we move into the legal framework, I just want to flag for you that the praise side of this craft, the well-chosen word that lifts a person or a household rather than levels it, the seasonal blessings, the everyday Irish witchcraft that protects rather than wounds, that side is still in living use here in Ireland. And I do have a podcast called Living Irish Witchcraft. If you want to have a look at that, definitely go and look it up. It's actually a playlist on this channel as well. So that's the kind of grounded Irish practice that I also write about each month in the Simple Irish Spells newsletter. And I'll come back to that at the end of the episode. So then we move on to the legal framework. So satire as actionable speech. And the reason I keep using the word regulated about satire is because it's very accurate. Brehon law, the Irish legal system that ran in this country for centuries until the English law forcefully replaced it through colonisation, treated satire as a category of legal speech act with consequences in both directions. Now, we see from Fergus Kelly's classic book, A Guide to Early Irish Law, which if you're interested in the Brehon law system, you really need to have a look at that. It's still the standard academic reference for the Brehon law. And what Kelly documents is that a poet who composed satire without just cause, very important, faced a legal penalty. The satire had to be honourable, and this penalty included a loss of their own honour price. So a poet whose unjust satire was prosecuted lost the very thing that their craft was designed to attack in others. So turnabout is fair play, I suppose. And on the other side of that, if the satire was just, if the target deserved it, the target had no legal recourse. So you couldn't come back and claim that they were lying or anything, because that was up to the Brehons to judge for the first part, right? So often these cases would be taken where it was up to the Brehon or the judge to decide, or sometimes the king, to decide if a satire was just or unjust. And the case had to be made in both directions, right? And obviously then there were magical consequences as well, such as the blemishes being raised from just satire. The satire itself was the legal recourse, and the community, the society, recognised that the poet had levied an appropriate verdict. So the poets, or the filí in this case, could act as judge, jury and execution. And the satire didn't just damage your reputation like the abstract. The tradition records that satire raised these 3 specific blisters on the face of its target. So they're named in Sanas Cormaic as anim and es, which would be fault, flaw and defect. So on a king, these blisters were enough to disqualify him from rule, because sacred kingship in early Ireland required physical wholeness and a visible blemish. And a visible blemish was incompatible with holding the office, the sovereign role. There's a primary source line from the law text, Brehon dícend, that captures the whole praise and satire dyad in a single sentence, really. The poets, the law text says, have a strange knowledge, which I quote, they say, satire with a hue of praising and praising with a hue of satire. End quote. So one craft, one trained voice capable of both directions, depending on the verdict the poet was levying. So when you read the early Irish material, which I know you're all doing, right? And you find satire described as something that physically wounds, that draws blisters, that ends careers. It's not a metaphor. It's a category of, again, legal speech act, which was deployed by this trained professional class, regulated in its application. There were sanctions there. There was accountability. The abuse of power was, I won't say it never happened, but it was certainly built in that the abuse of power would at least not go unchallenged, right? Because this was a huge power that the poets carried, and it was prosecutable if they misused it. So I guess the relevant point of all of this for this particular series is that the same poet could lift a king with praise, was also the poet who could end the very same king's reign with satire, and it was all dependent on the king's behaviour. Whereas our poets now, with our unworthy leadership. It was one craft and one trained voice, pointed in 2 directions, and the poet held both. What I want you to take from this episode and the series, I guess, is that the Irish cursing tradition had a name, a profession, and a whole body of law behind it. Air was a regulated craft. The filí were a trained professional class of very high standing, and the legal system of early Ireland treated their words with as much seriousness as it treated a judgment from a Brehon or a verdict from a king. Now, praise and satire were one craft, turned in two directions, and the poets held one. The next episode in this series is on the smiths and the millers, the crafts whose tools could heal a community or curse a landlord, one of my favourites. So subscribe to the channel and hit that bell for notifications to catch it when it goes live. And there's one last thing before you go. The praise side of this craft, the well-chosen word that lifts the household, as I mentioned earlier, the seasonal blessing, the everyday Irish witchcraft, that protects rather than wounds. That's the living half of this same coin. Now, it's not that cursing doesn't happen, but, I'm not going to be teaching that as part of this series, right? But the praise side of it, the protective side of it, is what I write about every single month in our Simple Irish Spells, which is a grounded, source-led newsletter with free posts every month and a paid tier for the deeper monthly content. So the link to subscribe to that, either for the free paid version, is in the description below. So slán go fóill, and I will see you in the next video.